Let me ask you something. What's the worst rumor you've ever heard about a politician? Corruption, affairs, maybe stealing money. Well, the Romans would laugh at that. Because their emperor Caligula didn't just abuse power, he turned it into a twisted game of incest, humiliation, and pure madness. This isn't a Netflix drama. This is real history. Imagine an emperor who sleeps with his sisters, steals brides from their weddings, and even threatens to make his horse a high priest. Yeah, that actually happened. So, are you ready to dive into the darkest bedroom in Roman history? Brace yourself. Because once you hear what Caligula did, you'll never look at the word emperor the same way again. If you love disturbing true history and you're brave enough to keep going, smash that like button, subscribe, and let's walk straight into the nightmare of Caligula's Rome. Caligula's life began not in innocence, but in the poisoned atmosphere of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Born in 12 CE as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he carried a name heavy with both glory and doom. His father Germanicus, celebrated as a beloved general of Rome, was hailed as the future of the empire. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended from the bloodline of Augustus himself. Yet in the Roman world, noble blood was rarely a blessing. It was a target. Germanicus died when Caligula was only 7 years old. His sudden illness in Antioch was long suspected to be the result of poisoning, likely ordered by Emperor Tiberius, the reigning ruler and Caligula's great uncle. For the young boy, the loss was not just personal but political. With Germanicus gone, the family became vulnerable, and every child of Agrippina was thrust into the deadly game of succession. Agrippina fought fiercely to protect her children's rights, but Rome's court was not a place of maternal shelter. It was a crucible of cruelty, where accusations were weapons and executions were spectacles of state control. Caligula's older brothers, Nero and Drusus, became victims of this system. Both were accused of treason, both imprisoned, and both died in confinement, either starved or driven to suicide. Their fate was not hidden from the boy. He grew up with the memory of brothers destroyed by imperial suspicion, a reminder that bloodline did not protect, it condemned. The palace itself was rife with darker rumors. The Julio-Claudian family was said to practice incest, both as a political strategy and as an indulgence in forbidden desire. Whether these rumors reflected truth or were the inventions of enemies, they shaped the atmosphere around Caligula's childhood. His mother was accused of unholy closeness to her sons, and whispers followed his sisters. Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, long before Caligula himself would later draw them into his reign of perversion. The boy's nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, came from his time living with the legions under his father's command. Soldiers dressed him in miniature armor, a child mascot for Rome's armies. To the common soldier, he was a charming figure, but behind the affectionate name lay a darker truth. The child who wore soldiers' boots would grow into a man who used power not for protection, but for torment. When his mother's defiance against Tiberius grew too bold, she too was destroyed. Agrippina was arrested, exiled to the island of Pandateria, and starved until she took her own life. Caligula was barely a teenager when he lost his mother to imperial cruelty. His family was systematically dismantled, one body at a time. He remained alive, but only by being absorbed into the household of the very man believed to have orchestrated their destruction. Emperor Tiberius. This was no ordinary guardianship. Tiberius had withdrawn to the island of Capri, surrounding himself with a court of debauchery and fear. Ancient sources describe the villa as a place of unspeakable acts, sexual exploitation of children, ritualized cruelty, and displays of absolute power over life and death, whether embellished by later historians or not. These accounts point to an environment that twisted the boundaries of morality. It was here that Caligula spent his formative years. A boy who had lost his father, brothers, and mother now lived under the shadow of a ruler whose very name inspired terror. To survive, Caligula learned to conceal his true feelings. Roman historians note that he mastered the art of appearing obedient and agreeable, while inwardly seething with hatred. The child of blood became a mask wearer, shaped by suspicion and surrounded by corpses. The dynasty's obsession with bloodline carried another weight, the merging of political power with sexual transgression. The stories of incest surrounding Caligula's family were not isolated scandals. They reflected a broader culture where absolute power warped the boundaries of kinship. In Rome, family was the state, and to corrupt the family was to corrupt the empire itself. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, Caligula was 24 years old. He had survived not by luck, but by absorbing the cruelty around him. The boy who once wore little boots had walked through years of betrayal, exile, and whispered incest. He was the last surviving son of Germanicus, heir to both glory and corruption. Rome celebrated his ascension as a moment of hope, the return of a beloved bloodline. But what Rome did not yet see was the shadow left by his childhood. Caligula's reign would be remembered for sadism, sexual perversion, and a descent into madness. Yet the seeds were sown long before he sat on the throne. They were planted in the blood of murdered brothers, in the hunger of an exiled mother, and in the warped intimacy of a dynasty that blurred the lines between family and possession. When Caligula entered the care of Emperor Tiberius, he was not stepping into safety, but into the darkest chamber of Roman power. The island of Capri, where Tiberius had withdrawn from public life, was said to be a place of extraordinary beauty. Cliffs, gardens, and villas, yet beneath its splendor lay the hidden machinery of corruption. The emperor, feared across the empire, turned this retreat into a private kingdom of excess where his will alone defined morality. For Caligula, still a teenager, the move was both elevation and entrapment. He had survived the destruction of his family by playing the role of the obedient child. Now he entered a court where obedience meant submission, not only to political authority, but to the emperor's personal desires. Ancient historians such as Suetonius and Tacitus painted Capri as a palace of perversion, where children, both boys and girls, were exploited in rituals of humiliation. Naked bodies were paraded for Tiberius' amusement. Acts that violated both Roman tradition and human dignity were staged as entertainment. The boy witnessed, and perhaps endured, practices that blurred every line between power and abuse. According to accounts preserved by Rome's historians, Tiberius surrounded himself with what were euphemistically called his minnows, children trained to satisfy him in the waters of his baths. Sexual exploitation was presented as play, but it was nothing less than domination. The emperor used innocence as an instrument of his appetite. Capri was not only a stage for private indulgence, it was also a place of calculated cruelty. Senators and nobles who fell from favor were brought to the island, accused of treason, and executed in carefully staged spectacles. Their bodies were hurled from the cliffs into the sea below, a message to all who questioned imperial power. Caligula, watching in silence, learned that survival meant concealing one's horror. He became a witness to both sexual corruption and political murder, lessons fused into one reality. In Rome, pleasure and terror were tools of rule. For Tiberius, these excesses were not mere indulgence, but expressions of ultimate control. The empire was vast, but Capri was his laboratory of domination. There, he could manipulate senators, destroy rivals, and bend human lives to his will. The court surrounding him, including the young Caligula, absorbed this culture of submission. To resist was to die. To comply was to survive. Historians disagree on the extent of the depravity described. Some suggest that later writers exaggerated Tiberius' vices to blacken his memory and glorify his successors. Yet, whether every detail was true or not, what matters is the impression these accounts left. Capri became a symbol of absolute corruption. And in that symbol, Caligula was not a passive guest, he was a pupil. The boy's childhood had already been marked by betrayal and blood. Now, in his adolescence, he was being instructed in the empire's darkest secret, that power was sustained not only by armies or laws, but by the breaking of human bodies and spirits. To rule meant to destroy, to desire meant to possess. These were not abstractions. They were lived realities, played out daily in the chambers and gardens of Capri. It was here that Caligula's understanding of family was further distorted. He was separated from his surviving sisters, deprived of maternal protection, and left in the hands of a man rumored to indulge in every forbidden act. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was infamous for its whispers of incest. But Capri brought those whispers into brutal clarity. Power collapsed the walls of taboo. Kinship itself became a weapon, intimacy a tool of submission. Caligula watched as others were humiliated, broken, and discarded. He learned that to show pity was to invite destruction. Silence and compliance became his shield. Yet beneath that mask of obedience, resentment grew. When Tiberius forced men of noble birth to kneel in degradation, Caligula saw not just victims, but models of what might one day be reversed. When children were reduced to playthings, he saw not just horror, but the raw demonstration of domination. The island was both a nightmare and a classroom. Every act of cruelty was a lesson. Every corpse thrown into the sea was a warning. Caligula endured, but he also absorbed. He understood that survival depended on mimicry, outward cheer, inward hatred. His own words are lost to history, but the scars of Capri surfaced later in the horrors of his reign. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, Rome rejoiced. The empire was wary of the old emperor's cruelty and his retreat from public life. Caligula, his great-nephew and chosen successor, was welcomed with ecstatic hope. To the public, he was the son of Germanicus, the child of a beloved hero, the promise of renewal. Yet the young man who stepped into power was not only the heir of Germanicus. He was also the product of Capri. Behind his smile lay the memory of children reduced to playthings, of senators hurled to their deaths, of a ruler who used cruelty as his currency. Capri had taught him that fear could be love, that violence could be loyalty, and that power without restraint was the only truth. In March of 37 CE, Emperor Tiberius died. Officially, the cause was natural illness. Unofficially, whispers of murder spread across Rome. Some said he had been smothered by a pillow, others that his body had simply refused to die until suffocated. Ancient sources diverge, but all agree that Caligula stood near the deathbed, ready to seize the empire. The boy who had once survived Capri now inherited the world's most powerful throne. The reaction in Rome was immediate and euphoric. Citizens poured into the streets to celebrate. Temples rang with prayers of gratitude. The Senate praised Caligula as a savior, declaring him a new dawn after the oppressive reign of Tiberius. Statues of his father Germanicus were paraded through the city, tying the young man to the legacy of a general adored by the legions. In Caligula, they believed Rome had found both continuity and renewal. For the first months, he played his role with skill. Caligula freed political prisoners, restored confiscated property, and honored the memory of his family. His gestures appeared merciful, even generous. He arranged funerals for his mother and brothers, offering them the dignity denied by Tiberius. He embraced the Senate with courtesy, showered the people with games and spectacles, and presented himself as the emperor who would heal old wounds. The public adored him. Coins bore his youthful image. Crowds cheered him in the circus. Veterans hailed him as the son of Germanicus, the man they had once followed into battle. For a brief moment, Rome believed in him. The scars of Capri were invisible, masked by charm and ceremony. But beneath the surface, shadows stirred. Caligula's succession had not been clean. Tiberius had named both Caligula and Gemellus, Tiberius' grandson, as heirs. Though Caligula was favored, the presence of another heir created danger. Within months, Caligula ordered Gemellus' execution. The boy, barely a teenager, was accused of plotting against him. Whether true or not, the accusation served its purpose. It eliminated a rival and reminded Rome that the new emperor's smile hid teeth. It was a forewarning of the darkness to come. Historians describe a turning point in these early months. Some blame a mysterious illness that nearly killed him, arguing that the trauma unhinged his mind. Others believe the illness revealed rather than created his instability. Whatever the cause, Caligula emerged from his brush with death changed. The charm that had delighted Rome hardened into cruelty. Gratitude gave way to suspicion. Mercy became vengeance. He began to test the boundaries of power, pushing against the Senate, humiliating nobles, and demanding divine honors. He insisted that his rule was not merely imperial but sacred, that his authority was equal to the gods. Temples were rededicated in his name, and altars were raised to his genius. For a people accustomed to emperors cloaking their power in modesty, the transformation was jarring. Caligula's relationship with his sisters revealed still deeper fractures. He elevated Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livilla to unprecedented honors, treating them as partners in rule. Ancient gossip accused him of incest, particularly with Drusilla, whom he adored openly. Whether exaggerated or not, these rumors reflected Rome's unease. The whispers of family corruption that had haunted his childhood now resurfaced, embodied in the actions of the emperor himself. Political killings followed swiftly. Senators who had once celebrated him were condemned. Accusations of treason multiplied, often based on little more than suspicion. Executions were staged not as necessity but as theater, reminders that loyalty to Caligula was not a choice but a matter of survival. And always, there was blood. The death of Gemellus, the silencing of critics, the quiet disappearances of nobles whose names faded from the record. Caligula's rule was crowned not only in ceremony, but in death. What had changed? Capri's lessons, buried beneath a mask of charm, were now rising to the surface. Caligula had watched Tiberius rule through fear and indulgence. Now, with the empire in his hands, he sought not just to imitate but to surpass. His games grew more extravagant, his demands more erratic, his pleasures more dangerous. He no longer concealed the scars of his past, he transformed them into weapons. For the people of Rome, the shift was gradual but undeniable. The emperor they had welcomed as a savior was becoming something far darker. The boy who had survived betrayal, exile, and perversion was now free to unleash his own desires without restraint. The mask of the darling son of Germanicus was slipping. In its place emerged a ruler shaped by blood cruelty and the intoxication of absolute power. Rome had crowned him with joy, but soon it would shudder at the cost of its hope. In the long shadow of Roman history, few scandals rival the intimacy Caligula claimed with his sisters. Among them, one stood above all: Julia Drusilla. She was not merely his confidante, nor merely his kin. To the emperor, she was something more, a figure he elevated to a place reserved for wives, for queens, even for goddesses. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had always been haunted by whispers of incest. Enemies accused Augustus' heirs of corrupting the bonds of kinship, but with Caligula, rumor became spectacle. From the earliest days of his reign, he treated his sisters not as relatives, but as political partners, seated beside him at banquets, honored in public, and given influence unprecedented for imperial women. Yet Drusilla occupied a role beyond even this. She was presented not just as favored sister, but as consort. The people of Rome watched uneasily as Caligula's attachment unfolded. He summoned her to sit beside him in the imperial box at the games. He referred to her with titles reserved for wives, and ancient sources claim he even swore oaths on her name. A gesture of intimacy that carried sacred weight in Roman culture. The Senate was compelled to honor her as Augusta, a title elevating her to imperial sanctity. Whispers spread that the relationship was not merely symbolic. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and other historians accused Caligula of open incest with Drusilla, flaunted without shame. The charge was shocking not only for its violation of moral boundaries, but for its political implications. In Roman tradition, family was the foundation of the state. To defile family was to desecrate the very order of Rome. Yet Caligula did not stop at secrecy. He displayed Drusilla as though she were his empress, introducing her to senators as partner in rule. Ancient writers record that he took her with him on campaigns, dined with her in state settings, and insisted on her presence at moments of ceremony. The message was unmistakable: Drusilla was not merely a sister, she was his queen. For Rome, the scandal was unbearable. Incest was condemned as a barbarian practice, associated with Egypt and the Ptolemies, whose royal bloodlines had long embraced the union of siblings. Caligula, by elevating Drusilla in this way, appeared to align himself with foreign corruption rather than Roman virtue. To the Senate, it was more than immorality. It was an emperor declaring himself above law, above custom, above the sacred boundaries that bound Rome together. But for Caligula, the breach was deliberate. By crossing the line, he demonstrated that there were no lines left to cross. To make Drusilla his consort was to show that he could bend Rome itself to his will. If family could be redefined, so too could morality, religion, and law. His reign was not simply tyranny, it was desecration. Drusilla herself remains a shadowed figure in history. Was she complicit, forced, or trapped by circumstance. The record does not tell us. What is clear is that she bore the weight of her brother's obsession. Elevated in public, she was also bound by him in ways no Roman woman could escape. She became both the symbol of his power and the vessel of his corruption. In 38 CE, tragedy struck. Drusilla fell ill and died, still in her early 20s. Caligula's grief was absolute. He ordered her deification, proclaiming her a goddess, Diva Drusilla. Temples were dedicated in her name, sacrifices offered to her spirit, and statues raised in her likeness. Rome had never seen such honors bestowed upon a sister, let alone one bound to the emperor by so scandalous a relationship. The Senate recoiled, but the people witnessed the birth of a new kind of imperial cult, one where private obsession became public religion. Drusilla's death marked a turning point. Caligula's grief, however genuine, deepened into madness. He began to see himself not only as emperor, but as divine consort of a goddess, united with her beyond death. The incestuous scandal did not die with Drusilla. Instead, it hardened into legend. Ancient sources claim Caligula later forced his surviving sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, into degradation, though both would eventually conspire against him. What began with Drusilla became a pattern. The emperor using family as possession, collapsing the walls between kinship, sexuality, and power. Rome was horrified but powerless. The emperor's authority was unchecked, and his willingness to flaunt taboos silenced opposition. To resist was to die. To remain silent was to watch as the sacred order of Rome unraveled. In Drusilla, Caligula revealed not only his obsession but his philosophy, that nothing was forbidden, that every boundary could be consumed by imperial will. Her elevation as both lover and queen was not merely personal. It was political theater, a declaration that Caligula was no longer bound by human law, nor even by the natural order itself. By the second year of Caligula's reign, the mask of promise had fallen away. The emperor who once charmed the Senate now revealed himself as master of humiliation. His power was not measured only in laws, armies, or executions, but in how deeply he could desecrate the bodies and dignity of Rome's elite. The imperial palace, once the seat of government, was transformed into a theater of degradation. Ancient accounts describe banquets that began with food and wine, but ended in ritualized obscenity. Senators and knights, the very men who governed the empire, were compelled to attend. Their wives and daughters were summoned alongside them, presented not as guests but as offerings. Caligula chose freely among them, selecting women for public violation. Their husbands and fathers were forced to watch, powerless to object, for objection meant death. Suetonius records that the emperor converted parts of the palace into a brothel. Noblewomen were stationed in chambers, displayed as prostitutes for Caligula's amusement and profit. Senators and equestrians were forced to enter, to witness their families reduced to commodities under imperial command. Coins were exchanged not for pleasure, but as tokens of humiliation. The transaction itself was symbolic, Rome's elite purchasing access to their own dishonor, orchestrated by their ruler. At these feasts, excess blurred into horror. Wine flowed without end. Music and laughter masked the undercurrent of dread. What began as revelry descended into an orgy where no one present could refuse. Caligula himself selected partners at will, boasting that he could turn matrons into harlots and virgins into concubines. His cruelty was not hidden, it was performed. The emperor wanted his victims not only defiled but seen to be defiled, their shame exposed to peers and rivals alike. The political function of these knights was unmistakable. By corrupting the wives and daughters of Rome's ruling class, Caligula demonstrated that no household, no lineage, no body was beyond his reach. Loyalty was not proven in speeches or decrees, but in surrendering what was most sacred. In Rome, marriage was both a private union and a political bond. By violating it, Caligula shattered the very foundations of aristocratic power. The humiliation extended beyond the act itself. He would return women to their husbands, mocking them for their inadequacy. He boasted publicly of his conquests, describing intimate details before the Senate. No man could defend his honor, for to challenge the emperor was suicide. Thus, silence became complicity. Rome's nobility learned to endure degradation with forced smiles, praying only to survive. Caligula's treatment of virgins was even more unsettling. Daughters of noble families, carefully preserved for strategic marriages, were summoned to the palace and stripped of their innocence in a single night. Their purity, once a currency in Rome's political alliances, was consumed as spectacle. The emperor's message was clear. Dynasties were no longer secured through family negotiation, but through his appetite. He alone determined the fate of Rome's future wives and mothers. The scale of this corruption shocked even hardened Romans. Prostitution was not foreign to the city, but the palace itself had never been so openly defiled. To the public, the emperor's actions blurred the line between ruler and pimp. The man entrusted with Rome's sacred traditions turned them into mockeries, twisting religion, marriage, and honor into objects of ridicule. But there was more than lust at work. Caligula's orgies were not indulgence alone, they were demonstrations of absolute authority. Power in Rome had always rested upon hierarchy, of gender, of class, of family. By turning Rome's most noble women into prostitutes and their husbands into silent spectators, Caligula inverted that hierarchy. He placed himself above all law, all morality, all restraint. The psychological effect was devastating. Rome's aristocracy, once the guardians of tradition, now lived in fear of summons to the palace. Each feast carried the threat of exposure, the certainty of shame. Men whispered their grievances in private, but could do nothing in public. Women endured what could not be resisted. Survival meant compliance, and compliance meant degradation. These nights did not occur in secrecy. The emperor ensured they became part of his legend. Accounts of his cruelty spread, and with them, the knowledge that Rome itself was being corrupted at its core. The palace had become a brothel, and the empire's most sacred bonds had become props in the theater of imperial power. For Caligula, sex was no longer human. It was ritualized domination, political weaponry, and performance of supremacy. His appetite was not measured by desire, but by the destruction of boundaries. Nothing was sacred, not wives, not daughters, not virginity, not marriage. Everything could be bought, mocked, or consumed, and all by the will of the emperor. Marriage in Rome was not simply a private affair. It was a political contract, a sacred bond, and the foundation upon which dynasties rose and fell. To marry was to cement alliances, secure inheritances, and strengthen one's place in the intricate web of Roman power. For the nobility, weddings were carefully orchestrated events, each union carrying immense consequence for the Senate and the empire alike. But when Caligula ruled, this ancient institution became a spectacle of cruelty. From the earliest days of his reign, Caligula's disdain for tradition was apparent. He treated the Roman elite not as partners in governance, but as playthings for his amusement. The emperor who once charmed the people quickly revealed a perverse fixation with the bonds of matrimony. To him, marriage was not sacred. It was a stage on which he could mock, humiliate, and assert dominion. Ancient sources recount how Caligula would insert himself directly into ceremonies, halting weddings in progress. Before stunned guests, he would seize the bride, declaring her now the property of the emperor. These abductions were not acts of passion, but of domination. By snatching women from the threshold of their new lives, Caligula announced to Rome that no family, no law, and no tradition could withstand his will. Among his most infamous acts was the marriage to Livia Orestilla, a woman who had already taken vows with another man. Caligula interrupted their wedding feast, ordering her into his presence and proclaiming her his wife. The groom, humiliated before the city, could do nothing. Within days, the emperor discarded her, her humiliation now complete. In another case, Caligula set his eyes on Lollia Paulina, celebrated for her wealth and beauty. He commanded her husband to divorce her immediately, claiming her as his bride. Yet once more, his interest was fleeting, and she too was abandoned after serving his momentary whim. Perhaps most grotesque was the emperor's brief union with Caesonia, a woman older than himself and already a mother. Though scandalous, this marriage was different. Caesonia was said to indulge Caligula's desires, feeding his delusions and sharing in his debauchery. With her, he appeared almost tender, though even this relationship was steeped in cruelty. On the day of her public unveiling, he paraded her before Rome, naked and adorned with jewels, turning marriage into a degrading spectacle. To the Roman people, these acts were far more than scandalous. They undermined the very foundations of society. Marriage was the backbone of Rome's moral order, the vessel through which lineage, virtue, and tradition were preserved. By treating wives as interchangeable objects, Caligula shattered the dignity of Rome's greatest families. Senators who prided themselves on ancient lineage were forced to watch their daughters, sisters, and wives claimed and discarded like slaves. Loyalty was not measured by counsel or governance, but by submission to the emperor's grotesque demands. Even more disturbing was the casual nature of his cruelty. Caligula did not pursue these unions for love, nor even for political calculation. They were acts of mockery, deliberate inversions of Roman values. By desecrating marriage, he desecrated Rome itself. The humiliation inflicted on the nobility was not private, it was public, meant to be seen and remembered. Each stolen bride, each discarded wife, was another reminder that no bond could shield one from imperial wrath. In mocking the sanctity of matrimony, Caligula weaponized one of Rome's oldest traditions. Families who had once wielded power through carefully arranged marriages now found themselves powerless. The Senate, once the guardian of Rome's laws, was reduced to silent complicity. To resist was to risk annihilation. To obey was to endure humiliation. The consequences were profound. Caligula's contempt for the institution of marriage deepened Rome's fear and hatred of him. His actions eroded not just the authority of the Senate, but the moral fabric of Roman society. What had once been the foundation of Roman stability became, under his reign, a theater of degradation. In the end, Caligula's mockery of marriage revealed the full extent of his tyranny. It was not enough for him to rule politically, he had to dominate socially, morally, and intimately. By making marriage his weapon, he ensured that even the most private moments of Rome's elite were subject to his cruelty. To understand the collapse of Caligula's sanity, one must confront the shadow of Drusilla, his sister confidante, and, as many ancient sources suggest, his lover. From childhood, the bond between them was said to be unnaturally close. While Roman siblings often lived intertwined lives for political alliances, Caligula's attachment to Drusilla was different. It was marked not by duty, but by obsession. Drusilla was not only his favorite sister, but the only one he openly trusted. He paraded her in public, seated her beside him as though she were his equal, and even allowed her to dine at military banquets. A privilege usually reserved for men of power, the Senate and people of Rome whispered, but none dared openly condemn the emperor. To question his bond with Drusilla was to invite ruin. Then, suddenly, she fell ill. Accounts vary, some say fever, others a mysterious wasting sickness. Whatever the cause, her death in 38 CE shattered the emperor's already fragile mind. For Caligula, this was not simply the loss of a sister. It was the death of the one person who anchored him to the world. His response defied every Roman custom. Caligula ordered public mourning of unprecedented scale. Festivals were cancelled, courts suspended, and laughter itself was forbidden. Any citizen caught smiling or celebrating was executed. In the eyes of Rome, grief had turned into tyranny. More shocking were the rituals he performed for her. Ancient historians claim he treated Drusilla not as a sister, but as a wife in death. He ordered funeral honors reserved only for empresses. Statues were raised in her likeness, and she was declared a goddess. Diva Drusilla, the Senate, already cowed by fear, passed decrees of deification at his demand, elevating her into the Roman pantheon alongside Juno and Venus. Whispers spread through Rome that Caligula had lain with Drusilla even as she was dying, and perhaps even after her death. Though these accounts remain unprovable, the very fact that such rumors flourished speaks to the climate of horror and scandal surrounding him. What had once been whispered suggestions of incest became, after Drusilla's death, an unavoidable stain on his reign. Her loss also marked a turning point in his behavior. Where once Caligula had displayed bursts of cruelty mixed with charm, now his actions became unrelenting in their madness. He retreated into paranoia, convinced that plots surrounded him. Senators, nobles, even members of his own family fell under suspicion. Executions multiplied. Treason trials, once rare, became daily spectacles. To grieve Drusilla was to show loyalty, to appear indifferent was treason. But it was not only violence that spiraled from his grief, it was perversion. Deprived of Drusilla, Caligula sought to immortalize their bond in grotesque ways. He demanded divine honors for himself as well, styling himself the living god and appearing in public dressed as Jupiter, Apollo, and even Venus. To the Romans, such blasphemous role-playing blurred every boundary of gender, family, and sanctity. To Caligula, it was a way of uniting himself with Drusilla in divinity, as though the siblings could rule eternally as gods. Even his surviving sisters were not spared. Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, both implicated in whispered incest, were later accused of conspiracy and exiled. It seemed that after Drusilla, no woman could satisfy his need for domination. Marriage, mistresses, courtesans, all became props in his theater of cruelty, none able to replace the sister he had lost. The people of Rome watched in dread. Mourning a sister was human, deifying her was shocking but survivable. But the escalating cruelty, the incestuous rumors, and the desecration of Roman tradition revealed something deeper. The emperor had severed himself from reality. His grief had not softened him. It had unchained the madness that simmered within. Historians often mark Drusilla's death as the true beginning of Caligula's downfall. The man who emerged after her passing was no longer the vibrant, young emperor once hailed as the heir of Augustus. He had become a figure consumed by paranoia, lust, and divine delusion. Rome itself would suffer the consequences, as the emperor's private anguish mutated into public horror. After Drusilla's death, Caligula sought a way to bind himself forever to the divine. He no longer spoke as a mortal emperor, but as one touched by the eternal. The Senate, terrified of his wrath, granted him titles that no Roman had ever dared claim. He was not simply princeps nor imperator, but dominus et deus, Lord and God. The emperor of Rome now declared himself divine while still walking among the living. Temples were ordered in his honor. Altars were raised, and priests were forced to offer sacrifices to his image. Citizens were commanded to kneel not merely in loyalty but in worship. To Caligula, Rome's gods, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, were rivals, not protectors. He mocked them by appearing in public dressed in their costumes, wearing Jupiter's thunderbolt, Apollo's lyre, or Venus's flowing gown. The people looked on in stunned silence, for laughter meant death. But Caligula's hunger for worship reached further than ritual sacrifice. Prayer and offerings no longer satisfied his divine appetite. He demanded submission of the flesh. Those brought into his presence were ordered to treat him as both God and lover. Men and women alike were summoned to his chambers, not as companions, but as worshippers. Refusal was impossible. For some, the humiliation ended quickly. For others, it lingered in grotesque performances staged before the emperor's court, where degradation became a form of ritual. In doing so, Caligula shattered the sacred order of Roman religion. The gods of Rome had always stood apart, eternal, untouchable, demanding reverence but never intimacy. Caligula blurred this boundary deliberately. By fusing lust with worship, he desecrated not just temples but the very idea of divinity. His body became the altar, his desires became the liturgy. For Romans raised on centuries of tradition, it was blasphemy beyond comprehension. Reports claim that Caligula even placed his statue in the great temple of Jerusalem, demanding the Jews worship him as God. The proposal nearly sparked rebellion across the province. To the monotheistic people of Judea, the idea was unthinkable. Yet even in Rome, where emperors had long been honored after death, the demand for living worship felt obscene. Citizens obeyed out of fear, not devotion. Priests trembled as they sacrificed before his likeness, knowing each gesture was a mockery of faith. The emperor's excesses extended further into cruelty. Noble families were humiliated by being forced to send their wives or daughters to his bed as offerings. Senators were compelled to stand in his presence while he boasted of defiling their women, declaring that their humiliation was proof of his divine right. Caligula's temple was not a sanctuary of prayer, but a theater of degradation. Even sacred festivals were twisted into spectacles of blasphemy. On days meant to honor Jupiter, Caligula appeared dressed as the god himself, parading through the streets as if the King of Heaven had descended to Rome. He accepted offerings at the altar, not with solemn reverence, but with mocking laughter. Wine was poured, incense burned, and chants filled the air. But it was no longer the worship of gods. It was the worship of a man consumed by lust and delusion. The people whispered in fear. To resist meant death, but to participate meant betraying the very foundations of Roman piety. Families performed the rites with trembling hands, unsure whether the gods themselves would punish them for their complicity. Caligula had not only defied mortal law, he had offended the heavens. His actions created a paradox that haunted Rome. To worship him was to desecrate the gods, yet to refuse was treason. This impossible choice broke the spirit of many. The emperor had turned religion, the heart of Roman identity, into an instrument of terror. Historians later wrote that never before had Rome's temples felt so defiled, nor its people so spiritually enslaved. Caligula's reign was no longer about politics, power, or even cruelty alone. It was about rewriting the boundaries between man, God, and beast, and dragging the Roman people into his nightmare of lust and blasphemy. For Caligula, cruelty was not simply punishment, it was entertainment. The emperor discovered a perverse delight in breaking Rome's most honorable men and women, not with the sword, but with shame. His court became a stage where humiliation was choreographed like a grotesque drama, and the Roman elite, once guardians of the empire's dignity, became unwilling actors. Senators, the most powerful men in Rome, were dragged into these spectacles. Caligula would summon their wives or daughters to his private chambers, defiling them while their fathers and husbands stood powerless. When he returned the women, he mocked their dignity by boasting openly about their performance. "Do not be ashamed," he sneered before the Senate, "for you have shared your home with the god of Rome." Each word was a dagger, for the men could not protest. To show outrage meant death, to remain silent meant dishonor. Nor were noblemen spared. Some were stripped of their fine robes and paraded naked before the court, forced to crawl on hands and knees while the emperor jeered. Others were dressed in women's clothing and ordered to dance for his amusement, their humiliation amplified by the laughter of soldiers and courtiers who dared not refuse. Caligula's mockery was deliberate. The pillars of Roman authority reduced to clowns, the very guardians of tradition humiliated until they resembled slaves. Banquets became theaters of debasement. What once had been feasts honoring the gods turned into orgies of mockery. Caligula commanded noble women to serve naked at the tables, their bodies displayed as offerings to his appetite. Senators were forced to watch as their wives, once symbols of Roman virtue, were treated as playthings. For the emperor, each cry of shame, each downcast eye, was a triumph greater than conquest. He enjoyed corrupting the bonds of family. At times he demanded fathers' hand over their daughters, or brothers their sisters, as proof of loyalty. Families, caught between defiance and survival, surrendered their loved ones to his appetite. Caligula delighted in their despair, declaring that only through such sacrifice could Rome prove its devotion. The humiliation extended to public displays. During games at the circus, he ordered nobles to perform like gladiators, armed not with steel but with mock weapons, their fear a spectacle for the crowd. Some were beaten, others ridiculed, all degraded before the very people they once ruled. Rome, once a civilization of honor and discipline, watched its leaders reduced to jesters at the whim of a mad god. Even sacred marriages were not safe. Caligula intruded upon wedding banquets, taking brides from their husbands on their very wedding night. Some he returned broken, others he kept for himself, announcing that he alone had the right to claim Rome's women. In this violation of matrimony, the emperor struck at the foundation of Roman dignity, turning vows of loyalty into public shame. Historians later wrote of his laughter echoing through the palace halls as men of the Senate bowed their heads in silence. They had once spoken with the authority of the Republic. Now they were puppets, their honor dismantled piece by piece under Caligula's hand. The emperor's power was not measured by laws or legions, but by how many noble men he could reduce to silence while their families wept. In this theater of humiliation, Rome itself became the audience and the victim. Citizens who once revered their leaders now saw them debased, stripped of dignity before their eyes. Respect for the Senate crumbled, and with it the moral fabric of the empire. What Caligula destroyed was not only the pride of men, but the collective dignity of Rome itself. Humiliation was more than cruelty. It was strategy. By breaking the nobility, he ensured no rival could stand against him. Fear silenced the Senate, disgust paralyzed the people, and shame chained even the proudest families. Rome was reduced not by war, but by laughter. Laughter that belonged to Caligula, echoing through a city turned into his grotesque theater. The story of Caligula and his horse Incitatus has echoed through history with disbelief. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and others, record that the emperor showered this animal with luxuries fit not for a beast of burden, but for an emperor. Marble stables, ivory mangers, purple blankets, and even golden feed troughs were bestowed upon the stallion. Attendants served him meals of oats mixed with gilded flakes. Guests were forced to bow before the horse as though it carried divine favor. At first glance, some dismissed this as a cruel joke, an emperor mocking Rome's traditions. But to those who lived under his reign, it was no laughing matter. Each indulgence given to Incitatus was an insult to Rome's senators and priests. When Caligula declared the horse a priest of Rome's gods, the Senate trembled. For this was not merely folly, it was sacrilege. By placing an animal in the role of sacred mediator, Caligula desecrated the spiritual order that bound Rome together. The insult deepened when he threatened, or perhaps even planned, to appoint Incitatus as consul. The consulship, once the pinnacle of Roman honor, the office held by statesmen, generals, and the guardians of the Republic, was reduced to farce. Senators who had bled for Rome, who had governed provinces and led legions, were forced to imagine themselves replaced by a horse. It was humiliation perfected. Not only were Rome's laws mocked, but so too were the men sworn to uphold them. Historians debate whether this act was literal or symbolic. Some argue it was satire, an emperor exposing the Senate's weakness by showing that even a beast could govern better than the men who dared oppose him. Others believe his madness was genuine, that Caligula truly envisioned his stallion not as an animal, but as a companion worthy of human honors. In either case, the message was unmistakable: Rome's institutions were meaningless. But beneath the laughter, there was also something darker. Ancient whispers spoke of Caligula's intimacy with his horse, rumors that blurred the line between bestiality and divine obsession. Whether slander or truth, the fact that such accusations circulated reveals the depths of horror his reign inspired. By entwining lust, mockery, and blasphemy, he made Incitatus not only a symbol of corruption, but of perversion. Banquets were held in the horse's name, guests compelled to toast the animal as though it were royalty. To refuse was treason. Senators reclined in their togas, raising cups of wine to a stallion while their emperor laughed. The humiliation was not confined to words, but ritualized through spectacle. Rome's highest class, once rulers of the Mediterranean world, now bowed to a beast. The symbolism was devastating. By enthroning his horse, Caligula declared himself untouchable. If a stallion could serve as priest, consul, or companion to the emperor, then what did Rome itself matter? Its sacred offices, its laws, its traditions, all lay shattered. In mocking Rome, Caligula was not merely insane, he was deliberate. He sought to erase the line between civilization and chaos, replacing the grandeur of the empire with the absurd theater of his will. Some ancient chroniclers interpreted this act as prophecy, a warning of Rome's decline. For if the empire could endure an emperor who worshipped his horse, what limit remained? Respect for law was gone. Religion was desecrated. Nobility was mocked. The empire stood naked, a mighty civilization reduced to parody. The story of Incitatus has endured not because of its humor, but because of its horror. Whether truth or satire, it captured the essence of Caligula's reign: madness wielded as power, humiliation as strategy, blasphemy as entertainment. In raising his horse above Rome's most sacred offices, he revealed his true belief, that he alone mattered, and that the empire existed only to amuse him. The Rome of 41 AD was no longer the proud empire Augustus had built. It was a city trembling under the deranged whims of one man. Caligula's cruelty had infected every corner of Roman life. Senators feared public humiliation, nobles endured forced debasement, and families grieved as loved ones were executed on nothing more than suspicion. Even his guards, the praetorians sworn to protect him, chafed under his sadism. Each day, Caligula grew more unstable. He openly mocked Rome's laws, dressed as gods, and demanded to be worshipped as a living deity. He slept with sisters, defiled matrons, and ridiculed senators in front of crowds. He robbed temples, executed innocents, and laughed as Rome's honor disintegrated before him. No one was safe, not even those closest to him. In whispers, a question began to stir: could Rome survive this emperor? Plots were whispered in the marble corridors of the Palatine. Senators who once cowered now weighed the risk of action. Officers of the Praetorian Guard, once loyal, began to dream of freedom. Even courtiers who shared in his debauchery now saw their own necks at risk. Caligula had alienated all who might have defended him. The breaking point came after yet another round of humiliations. Ancient writers speak of his cruelty towards the Senate, of forcing noblemen to run beside his chariot, of mocking generals with fake triumphs, of threatening to make his horse consul. He demanded new temples be built in his honor, where Romans would sacrifice as though to Jupiter himself. For many, this was blasphemy beyond endurance. The conspirators gathered. Senators like Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard, whom Caligula had mocked as effeminate and weak, now vowed revenge. Others joined, driven not by honor but by survival. To leave Caligula alive was to invite their own destruction. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would strike when Caligula was most vulnerable, not in battle, but in the palace, surrounded not by legions, but by actors, servants, and jesters. The day chosen was January 24, 41 AD, during the festival of Palatine Games. The emperor entered the theater, surrounded by dancers and musicians. He smiled, basking in the adoration he forced upon Rome. He did not see the daggers hidden in the robes of men who bowed before him. He did not hear the whispers echoing in the corridors. As he left the theater for a passageway beneath the palace, the assassins struck. Chaerea was first. With steel in his hand, he drove his blade into the emperor who had mocked him. Caligula screamed, not as a god, but as a man. Others followed, stabbing again and again. His body, once adorned in divine robes, was torn apart by steel and blood. The emperor of Rome, the self-proclaimed god, fell in the dirt of his own palace, gasping for air as the conspirators hacked at him without mercy. He was 28 years old. His reign had lasted barely 4 years. Years soaked in cruelty, perversion, and madness. Yet the fury of the assassins did not stop with him. His wife, Caesonia, was killed, her head dashed against a wall. His infant daughter, Drusilla, was slaughtered before she could cry out. Rome demanded not only the end of a tyrant, but the extermination of his line. When the deed was done, his blood pooled in the shadows of the palace halls. The body of a man who had demanded worship as a god now lay butchered, discarded, and unrecognizable. Senators breathed freely. Praetorians whispered prayers of relief, and citizens dared to hope that the nightmare had ended. But the truth was darker. Caligula's death was not the end of Rome's madness. It was only the beginning of a cycle of emperors who would bleed the empire dry. The monster was gone, but the world that had birthed him remained. The blood of Caligula stained the marble corridors of the Palatine. His body, hacked to pieces by men who once bowed to him, lay crumpled in the dirt. The emperor who had dressed as gods, who mocked the Senate, who defiled his sisters and slaughtered his kin, was no more. His voice of madness was silenced. But Rome did not awaken to peace. It awoke to shock. The empire had killed its emperor, not through law, not through trial, but through a desperate act of steel. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the ruler of Rome, had instead delivered the final blows. Senators who plotted for survival cheered, yet trembled. They had slain a god in the eyes of the people, and the blood spilled could never be gathered back. The corpse of Caligula was hurriedly buried in a shallow grave on the Esquiline hill, like that of a common criminal. Only later did his sisters exhume the body and cremate it, giving him the rights denied in life. Yet even this act of pity could not cleanse his name. To the people, he was no longer an emperor. He was a monster. Rome remembered not his birth as the cherished son of Germanicus, not the hopeful dawn when he first took power, but the darkness that followed. His legacy was incest, blasphemy, executions, and debauchery. He became the living example of what happens when unchecked power twists a man into something less than human. Whispers of his deeds traveled across the empire. In taverns and marketplaces, mothers told their children of the emperor who wished to make his horse consul, who mocked generals with false victories, who slept with his sisters and demanded their worship. He was no longer flesh. He had become a cautionary tale. The senators, fearful of their own fate, attempted to restore the republic after his death. They argued Rome had no need of emperors, that the old order might return. But the Praetorian Guard, having killed one ruler, would not surrender their power. They found a new emperor, Claudius, hiding behind curtains in the palace. Dragged into the light, he was hailed as princeps. Rome had not ended tyranny. It had merely exchanged one tyrant for another, and so Caligula's shadow endured. His murder solved nothing. His madness lived on, not in his bloodline, but in the memory of Rome itself. The empire would see new emperors rise and fall, some wise, many cruel. Yet none would ever be remembered with the same horror. Historians of later centuries, from Suetonius to Cassius Dio, preserved his name in ink and venom. They wrote of his incest, his murders, his games of humiliation. They painted him as a beast disguised as a man, a ruler who spat on gods and law alike. Perhaps some tales were exaggerated, some invented to satisfy the hunger for scandal. But the truth was already black enough. No invention was needed. Even in death, Caligula was immortalized in infamy. His reign became the eternal lesson that Rome could not forget that absolute power, unchecked by morality, turns a man into a monster. For centuries after, his ghost haunted the empire. Each time a ruler grew cruel, each time emperors demanded worship, Romans whispered the same name, Caligula. He was not merely a tyrant who lived and died. He was the embodiment of power's corruption. In the end, Caligula achieved the immortality he craved, but not in the temples he demanded, nor in the statues he raised. His immortality was carved into memory as horror, as revulsion, as the emperor who defiled family, mocked the Senate, and drenched Rome in blood. And as long as history is told, his name will remain not as a god, but as a warning of what it means when humanity is abandoned for madness.